In 2009, on a day that looked ordinary to the world, Michael Jackson said goodbye. Not with words, not with tears, but with a silence so heavy that only one person truly felt it. Cameras captured his smile. Fans saw his rehearsals, and the headlines spoke of a comeback. Yet something in his eyes told a different story. Why did Michael act as if time was slipping through his hands? Who was the single person who sensed the truth? And what did Michael do in his final moments that made it clear he already knew what was coming? That day was not just another day. It was a hidden farewell the world would only understand too late. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our emotional stories about Michael Jackson. Los Angeles was bright that morning, almost painfully bright. The kind of light that made everything look hopeful even when it was not. Traffic rolled slowly along the wide streets. Palm trees swayed in the heat, and the city hummed with its usual restless rhythm. From the outside, June 24th, 2009 looked like any other day in Hollywood, full of noise, ambition, and illusion. Inside the rehearsal studio, however, the air felt different. Michael Jackson stood at the center of the room, surrounded by mirrors that reflected him from every angle. Speakers lined the walls. Dancers stretched on the floor. Technicians adjusted lights. Assistants whispered schedules. Cameras waited silently in the corner, ready to capture every movement. He looked thinner than usual. His face was calm, almost too calm. His eyes, however, carried something heavy, something no camera could quite explain. Michael tied the laces of his rehearsal shoes slowly, as if time itself had begun to move at a different pace for him. He glanced around the room, not with the sharp focus of a perfectionist, but with the tenderness of someone trying to remember every detail before it slipped away. The dancers began to move. Music filled the space, powerful, familiar, iconic. Michael stepped forward. At first, his body moved with the same precision the world had known for decades. But there was a softness in his movements, a vulnerability that made even his closest collaborators pause. One of the dancers, a young woman named Talia, noticed it immediately. She had worked with Michael before, and she knew his energy like a second language. Today, something was off. Not in his performance, that was flawless, but in his presence. Between songs, Michael did not sit right away like he usually did. Instead, he walked to the edge of the stage area and stared at the empty seats beyond the studio walls, as if imagining thousands of fans already watching him. Talia approached him carefully. "You okay, Michael?" she asked gently. He turned to her and smiled. Not a performer's smile. A real one. "I'm just taking it all in," he said. She studied him for a moment. "You look tired." Michael let out a small laugh, almost sad. "Aren't we all?" But the way he said it felt like more than simple exhaustion. They returned to rehearsal. As the music shifted into a slower piece, Michael closed his eyes and moved with deep emotion. His arms stretched outward, his body leaning into melody like someone reaching for something just beyond their grasp. When the song ended, silence hung in the room. No one clapped. It felt too sacred for that. Michael stood still, breathing softly, tears barely visible in his eyes. Talia felt a chill. She had seen Michael perform hundreds of times, but never like this. After rehearsal, as everyone packed up, Michael lingered. He walked slowly through the empty studio, running his hand along the walls, touching the mirrors, even brushing his fingers against the cold metal of a speaker. It was as if he was saying goodbye, not to a place, but to a life. Outside, the sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky. Michael stepped into the parking lot, where his car waited. Before getting in, he stopped and looked up at the clouds. He stood there for a long moment. Talia, who had followed him out, watched from a distance. He did not look like a man preparing for a comeback. He looked like someone preparing to leave. Later that evening, Michael arrived at his home. The house was quiet, almost unnaturally so. His children were not with him that night, and the emptiness seemed to weigh heavily on his heart. He walked through the halls slowly, touching photographs on the walls. Images of his childhood, of his family, of his career, of his life. In his bedroom, he sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. He placed his hands together, closed his eyes, and whispered something no one would ever hear. A prayer, a promise. or a farewell. Hours passed. Sleep did not come easily. Michael stood by the window in the early hours of the morning, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He rested his forehead against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. Somewhere inside him, he seemed to know that time was no longer on his side. The next day, he returned to rehearsal. This time, his presence was even more intense. He hugged each dancer before they began. He thanked the technicians personally. He smiled at people he barely spoke to before. Talia watched him closely. During a break, she handed him a bottle of water. He took it, but instead of drinking, he held it in his hands and stared at it as if it were something fragile and irreplaceable. "You've been amazing today," she said softly. Michael looked at her for a long moment, his eyes deep, searching. "You're special, you know that?" he said. She laughed nervously. "We all are because of you." He shook his head gently. "No, you are." The way he spoke made her heart ache. That night, after rehearsal, Michael did something unusual. Instead of leaving immediately, he walked back into the empty studio alone. Talia stood in the doorway and watched. Michael stood at the center of the space, arms outstretched, as if embracing an invisible audience. His lips moved silently. Then, slowly he bowed, not to the crew, not to the cameras, to the empty room. Talia felt tears well in her eyes. She did not understand why, but she knew she had just witnessed something final. When Michael turned around, he saw her. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Michael walked toward her and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Take care of yourself," he said. The words sounded ordinary, but the way he said them made them feel like goodbye. That night, as Michael drove away, Talia stood in the parking lot long after his car disappeared. She had a sinking feeling in her chest, a feeling she could not shake, a feeling that something terrible was coming, and that Michael knew it. Hours later, in the darkness of his home, Michael lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The silence was thick. His breath was slow. His thoughts were deep. Somewhere in that quiet, he whispered one last thing into the night, a sentence no one would ever hear clearly. But the weight of it would echo forever. And in that moment, only one person in the world truly understood what he was doing. Only one person had sensed the truth. And by the time the world realized what that day really meant, it would already be too late. The house was still when dawn arrived. Not the gentle stillness of sleep, but a heavy quiet that seemed to press against the walls, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Curtains hung motionless. Hallways stretched empty. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked slowly, each second sounding louder than it should have. Michael lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He had not slept. His body was tired, but his mind refused to rest. Thoughts drifted through him like fragments of unfinished songs, memories, faces, stages, lights, children's laughter, applause, and silence all blending together in a slow, aching rhythm. He turned onto his side and looked at the empty pillow beside him. For a moment he closed his eyes, as if trying to feel something that was no longer there. Then he sat up slowly, his movements careful, as though even the act of standing might disturb something fragile in the room. Barefoot, he walked across the cold floor toward the window. The first light of morning filtered through the curtains, painting soft patterns across the walls. He pulled the fabric aside and gazed out at Los Angeles, still half asleep beneath a pale sky. Cars moved like small, distant lights. Palm trees stood tall against the horizon. Life was beginning again. Michael rested his forehead against the glass. His breath fogged the surface. He whispered something so quiet even he could barely hear it. "Not yet." Downstairs, the house began to stir. Footsteps echoed faintly. A staff member moved through the kitchen, preparing coffee that Michael would probably not drink. Somewhere a phone buzzed, unanswered. Michael stepped away from the window and walked toward his dresser. He picked up a photograph, one of his children laughing in sunlight. His fingers traced their faces gently, almost reverently. For a long moment, he simply held it to his chest. Then he placed it back down with care. When his assistant arrived later that morning, she found him sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed, his hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing. "Michael," she said softly, It's time. He looked up at her slowly, as if returning from a faraway place. I know, he replied. The drive to the rehearsal studio felt longer than usual. Traffic flowed normally, but to Michael, everything seemed stretched, slowed, unreal. He stared out the window, watching buildings pass by like memories he could almost recognize but not fully grasp. In the back seat, he held a small notebook in his hands. Inside were lyrics, sketches of choreography, and handwritten thoughts that only he would ever fully understand. He flipped through the pages slowly, pausing on certain lines as if committing them to his soul. When they arrived, the studio looked the same as it had the day before. Bright lights, polished floors, mirrors lining the walls, dancers warming up, technicians adjusting sound levels. But the energy in the room had shifted. People spoke in hushed tones. They watched Michael more closely than usual. Talia was already there. She stood near the edge of the floor, stretching, but her eyes were on him the moment he stepped inside. Something in his posture made her stomach tighten. He walked in without his usual burst of presence. Instead, he moved almost quietly, as if trying not to disturb the space. When he reached the center of the room, he stopped. He closed his eyes. For several seconds, he simply stood there, breathing. The music began. Michael moved, but this time it was different. His body did not perform. It revealed. Every step, every turn, every extension of his arms felt like a confession. His face carried an emotion so raw that several dancers had to look away. At one point, during a slower piece, he reached out toward an invisible audience, his hand trembling slightly in midair. His lips parted, as if he were about to say something, but no words came. When the song ended, silence fell again. This time, it fell heavier. Michael stood frozen in place, chest rising and falling, tears shimmering in his eyes but never falling. Talia felt her throat tighten. She had seen brilliance, pain, joy, and exhaustion in Michael before, but this felt like something else entirely. After a long moment, Michael lowered his arms and exhaled. He walked toward the edge of the stage area and sat down slowly, resting his elbows on his knees. Talia approached him. Michael, she said softly, you were incredible. He looked up at her, and for the first time that morning, truly focused. His gaze was deep, almost painfully clear. Did you feel that? He asked. She hesitated. Feel what? He studied her for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak the truth. Then he smiled, not his performer's smile, but something gentler. Nothing, he said quietly, during a break. Michael moved through the room differently than before. He thanked people personally, the lighting technician, the sound engineer, even a young intern who rarely spoke to him. He shook hands. He hugged. He lingered longer than necessary. Talia watched him closely. When he passed by her again, he stopped. Walk with me, he said softly. They stepped into a quiet hallway behind the studio, away from the noise and movement. The air was cooler there, quieter, almost sacred. Michael leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. Talia stood beside him, unsure what to say. Finally, he spoke. You ever feel like time is moving too fast? He asked. She considered the question carefully. Sometimes. He nodded slowly. Me too. There was a long pause. Then he turned to her. You notice things, he said. She felt a chill run through her. What do you mean? He studied her face, almost tenderly. You see people, he said, not just what they do. Her heart began to race. Before she could respond, he straightened and looked down the empty hallway. I want you to remember something, he continued. Her breath caught. What? He hesitated, just for a second. Remember that every moment matters, he said softly. Even the ones no one is watching. The words lingered between them. They returned to rehearsal. Michael worked harder than anyone else in the room, but there was no tension in him. Only intensity, focus, and something that felt dangerously close to farewell. At the end of the day, when everyone began to pack up, Michael did not rush to leave. He walked slowly through the studio once more, touching the mirrors, the speakers, the edge of the stage area, as if trying to imprint the space into his memory. Talia stood in the doorway again, watching. Michael stepped to the center of the room. He lifted his arms. And then, just as he had the night before, he bowed, deeply respectfully, to the empty space. When he straightened, his eyes met hers across the room. This time, tears filled them. He walked toward her. She felt her heart pounding in her chest. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder again. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she whispered. He smiled faintly. "For seeing me." He turned and walked away before she could say anything else. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. Michael stood beside his car for a long moment before getting in. He looked up at the sky, watching the colors shift from gold to pink to deep purple. His expression was calm, almost peaceful. When he finally slid into the back seat, Talia remained standing there, unable to move. She watched the car disappear down the street. A knot tightened in her chest. That night, Michael returned home again to an empty house. He walked through the halls slowly, stopping in his children's rooms, standing in their doorways, watching the shadows on the walls. In his bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed. He folded his hands. He bowed his head, and he prayed, not for success, not for fame, for time, for peace, for the people he loved. When he finally lay down, sleep did not come easily. His eyes remained open, fixed on the ceiling. Somewhere deep inside, he seemed to understand something he could not, or would not, say out loud. Hours later, as the first light of another morning crept through the curtains, Michael closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. His face softened. And in that quiet, before the world woke up, only one person carried the weight of what he'd been trying to say. Talia lay awake in her own apartment across the city, staring at the ceiling, haunted by his words, his bow, his eyes. She felt it in her bones. Something was coming. And Michael knew. Night wrapped Los Angeles in a fragile calm that felt almost deceptive. From Michael's bedroom window, the city shimmered like a field of distant stars, each light carrying a story he would never fully know. The room was dim, illuminated only by a small lamp on his bedside table, and the pale glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. The air felt heavy, as if something invisible were pressing gently against the walls. Michael sat upright on the edge of his bed, hands resting loosely on his knees, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. His breathing was slow, careful, measured, not like a man preparing for sleep, but like someone trying to remain present in a moment that felt unbearably fragile. He looked toward the hallway where his children's rooms lay quiet. For a long time, he simply listened to the faint hum of the house, to his own heartbeat, to the silence that seemed to stretch endlessly around him. At some point, he stood, barefoot. He crossed the room and opened the door just enough to see down the hall. Soft shadows lined the walls. Everything was still. He walked to his children's door and paused. He did not enter. Instead, he rested his forehead against the frame and closed his eyes. A whisper left his lips, so faint it barely disturbed the air. "I love you." Back in his room, Michael sat at his desk. In front of him lay his small notebook, the one he carried everywhere, filled with lyrics, sketches, and thoughts that felt too personal for the world. He opened it slowly, as if afraid the pages might break. His pen hovered above the paper. For several minutes, he did not write. Finally, he began. His handwriting flowed differently than usual, softer, slower, more deliberate. He wrote words that felt less like art and more like truth. Sentences about gratitude, about time, about how fragile life could be beneath the shine of fame. At the bottom of the page, he paused. Then he wrote a single line. "Remember me as I truly was." He stared at it for a long time before closing the notebook. The next morning arrived quietly. Michael woke before dawn, his body still heavy from lack of rest, but his mind strangely clear. He moved through the house with careful steps, as if trying not to disturb something sacred. In the kitchen, his assistant was already awake, preparing coffee and checking messages. She looked up when she saw him. "You're up early," she said gently. Michael offered a small smile. "I wanted to see the sunrise." She nodded, unsure why the statement felt so meaningful. He stepped outside onto the patio. The sky was a soft blend of blue and gold, the first light of day creeping slowly across the horizon. Michael stood still, His face turned upward, breathing deeply as if trying to absorb the moment into his soul. He did not rush. He did not speak. He simply watched. When the sun finally broke free from the edge of the city, bathing everything in warm light, Michael closed his eyes and whispered something no one else could hear. Then, as if a decision had been made inside him, he turned and went back inside. Rehearsal that day felt different from the moment he arrived. The room was quieter, more attentive, more aware. Michael moved with a grace that felt almost otherworldly, his body flowing to choreography with both power and tenderness. Every step seemed intentional, every pause meaningful. Talia stood near the back, watching him closely. She noticed how often he looked toward the empty space where the audience would eventually be, how his gaze lingered as if he were already speaking to them. During one slower piece, Michael stopped mid-movement. The music continued. For a moment, everyone froze, thinking he might be tired. Instead, he slowly lifted his arms, palms open, and tilted his face upward. Tears shimmered in his eyes. No one spoke. After several seconds, he lowered his arms and continued as if nothing had happened. But the room knew. Something had shifted. During a break, Michael walked over to Talia. He did not smile in the way people expected. His expression was calm, almost peaceful. "You didn't come to rehearsal just to dance," he said quietly. She swallowed. "I came because this matters." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good," he said. They stood in silence for a few seconds. Then he placed his hand gently over his heart. "Hold on to that feeling," he said. "It will guide you." She felt her throat tighten, but said nothing. At the end of rehearsal, Michael did not rush out as he usually did. Instead, he gathered everyone together in a loose circle. There was no speech prepared, no grand announcement. He simply looked around at each face, dancers, technicians, assistants, musicians, and took them in. "Thank you," he said softly, "for your work, for your energy, for your hearts." Some people smiled. Others felt tears well in their eyes. Michael stepped back, bowed slightly, not like a performer, but like a man expressing deep respect, and then walked toward the exit. Outside, the sky was beginning to change again, the colors shifting toward evening. Michael stood beside his car, looking up at the clouds the same way he had the day before. This time, he did not look unsettled. He looked resolved. As the car pulled away, Talia remained in the parking lot, arms wrapped around herself, a strange ache settling in her chest. That night, Michael returned home once more. The house was quiet, too quiet. He moved through the halls slowly, stopping in front of each room, lingering as if committing every detail to memory. The shape of the walls, the softness of the carpet, the faint scent of home. In his bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed again. He folded his hands. He bowed his head. This time, his prayer felt different. Not desperate, not afraid, almost accepting. When he finally laid down, his eyes closed more easily than they had in days. His breathing softened. His face relaxed. Somewhere across the city, Talia stared at her ceiling, unable to sleep, her mind replaying his words, his bow, his eyes. She felt certain now, terrifyingly certain. Michael was saying goodbye, and when dawn came again, the world would wake up to a reality it was not prepared to face. The morning arrived with a deceptive gentleness. Sunlight slipped through the curtains in thin golden lines, painting the walls of Michael's bedroom in soft warmth. The city outside was already awake. Distant cars moving, birds calling, life beginning its familiar rhythm. But inside the house, time felt suspended. Michael did not stir right away. For several long moments, the only sound in the room was his slow breathing and the faint hum of the air conditioner. His face looked calm, almost peaceful, as if he had finally surrendered to rest after many sleepless nights. Eventually, he opened his eyes. He did not rush. He did not sit up quickly. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, as if trying to memorize its shape, its texture, the way the light touched it. His expression carried something quiet and heavy, something that felt like both acceptance and sorrow. Slowly, he turned his head toward the empty pillow beside him. His hand rested there for a moment, fingers brushing the fabric as if he were touching an invisible presence. Then he rose. Barefoot, he walked across the room toward the window and pulled the curtains back just enough to see the sky. It was a clear morning, almost impossibly blue, the kind of sky that makes the world feel larger and smaller at the same time. Michael pressed his forehead gently against the glass. His breath fogged the surface. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "Thank you." Downstairs, the house began to move. Footsteps echoed faintly along the hallway. The scent of coffee drifted upward. Voices murmured in low tones. Everything looked normal on the surface, routine, controlled, familiar, but Michael moved differently. He walked through the house slowly, touching door frames, pausing in hallways, stopping in front of photographs that lined the walls. His fingers traced the edges of pictures showing his children smiling, his family gathered, moments of laughter frozen in time. In each pause there was intention. In each touch there was tenderness. He stopped outside his children's rooms. He stood there for a long time. He did not open the doors. Instead, he rested his hand against the wood and closed his eyes. His lips moved silently. When he turned away, his expression carried both love and a quiet sadness that no one around him fully understood. In the kitchen, his assistant greeted him softly. "Good morning, Michael." He smiled at her, not the dazzling public smile, but something real and fragile. "Good morning," he replied. He accepted a glass of water, but barely touched it. Instead, he sat at the table and stared out the window at the bright morning light spilling across the garden. For several minutes, he said nothing. His assistant shifted nervously, sensing something unusual but unable to name it. Finally, Michael spoke. "Isn't the light beautiful today?" She glanced outside, then back at him. "Yes, it is." He nodded slowly, as if storing the image inside his heart. Later, the car arrived to take him to rehearsal. Michael stepped outside and paused on the patio before entering the vehicle. He lifted his face toward the sky, breathing deeply, as if trying to carry the moment with him. Then he turned and climbed into the back seat. The drive felt quiet. Too quiet. Michael stared out the window the entire time, watching the city pass by like a moving painting. Streets, buildings, palm trees, all sliding past in slow motion. When they reached the studio, the energy inside was tense. People spoke in whispers. Some avoided looking directly at him. Others watched him too closely. Talia was already there. The moment she saw him, her chest tightened. He looked the same, yet somehow different, calmer, farther away. Michael moved through the room slowly, greeting people with soft nods, brief touches on shoulders, quiet words of appreciation. When the music began, he stepped into the center of the floor. This time, his movements were not only precise, they were heartbreaking. Every step carried meaning. Every gesture felt like a message. During a slower sequence, Michael stopped mid-performance. The music continued beneath him. He stood perfectly still, arms outstretched, eyes lifted toward the ceiling, as if he were reaching for something beyond the room. Talia felt tears fill her eyes. She could not explain why. After several seconds, Michael lowered his arms and continued as if nothing had happened. But the room knew. Something irreversible was unfolding. During a break, Michael approached Talia again. She swallowed, trying to steady her voice. "You're incredible today," she said softly. He looked at her with a depth that made her heart ache. "No," he replied gently. "You are." He placed his hand over his heart again, just as he had the day before. "Remember what I told you," he said. She nodded, unable to speak. At the end of rehearsal, Michael gathered everyone once more. There was no applause, no celebration, just stillness. He looked around the room slowly, taking in every face, every presence, every person who had been part of his world. "Thank you for walking this path with me," he said quietly. Some people felt a chill. Others blinked back tears. Michael bowed, deeper than before, not as a performer, but as a man expressing profound gratitude. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken into evening. Michael stood beside his car again, looking up at the clouds as if searching for something only he could see. His expression was peaceful, resolved. When the car pulled away, Talia remained standing there, her heart heavy, her mind racing, her intuition screaming that something was terribly wrong. That night, Michael returned home. The house was silent again. He moved through the halls slowly, stopping in front of each doorway, each photograph, each memory, as if closing chapters inside himself. In his bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed. He folded his hands. He bowed his head. This time, his prayer was not urgent. It was gentle, grateful, almost serene. When he finally laid down, his eyes closed easily. His breathing softened. His face relaxed into a stillness that looked almost sacred. Across the city, Talia lay awake, staring at her ceiling, haunted by his bow, his words, his gaze, and the unbearable feeling that had settled deep inside her. She knew now, with terrifying clarity. Michael had been saying goodbye, and when morning came again, the world would be forced to understand what only she had truly felt. Dawn did not arrive gently that day. It crept in slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the sky itself sensed that something irreversible was about to unfold. The light slipped through the curtains in pale ribbons, brushing across Michael's face where he lay still, too still, in his bed. The house remained quiet, too quiet. In the early hours, footsteps moved softly down the hallway. A voice called his name once, then again, more urgently, but there was no answer. The silence deepened, thick and impossible to ignore. Inside the room, the air felt heavy. A hand touched his shoulder. No movement. A second passed. Then another. Panic replaced calm. The house woke violently. All at once, voices rose. Phones rang. Doors opened. People rushed through hallways that had felt sacred only hours before. What had been stillness turned into chaos. Paramedics arrived with speed that felt both frantic and useless. The bedroom filled with movement, flashing lights, urgent voices, hands pressing against his chest, breath forced where breath no longer came naturally. But Michael did not return. Not this time. Outside, the sun finally rose fully into the sky, bright and indifferent, bathing Los Angeles in warmth that felt cruel in its beauty. And the world did not yet know. Across the city, Talia sat upright in her bed, jolted awake by a feeling she could not explain. Her heart pounded hard in her chest, her breath uneven, her body trembling without reason. She stared at the wall. Her mind replayed his eyes, his bow, his words, his silence. Something inside her broke. She reached for her phone before she even understood why. Then the news came, first as a rumor, then as a headline, then as a reality that shook the entire world. Michael Jackson was gone. Talia dropped her phone. Tears flooded her face. Every memory crashed into her at once. The way he had touched the mirrors, the way he had bowed to an empty room, the way he had placed his hand over his heart, the way he had thanked her simply for seeing him. She understood then. He had known. The studio where they had rehearsed fell into stunned silence as the day unfolded. Dancers stood frozen. Technicians sat on the floor. No one spoke for a long time. Some cried. Some stared blankly at the mirrors that had reflected him only days before. Talia returned there later that afternoon. The room was empty. The lights were off. Dust floated in beams of sunlight that slipped through the windows. She walked slowly to the center of the space where Michael had stood, where he had reached upward, where he had bowed, where he had said goodbye without saying the words. She closed her eyes. In the quiet, she could almost feel him there, not as a star, not as a legend, as a man who had known his time was slipping away. She bowed, not as a dancer, not as an employee, but as someone who had been trusted with a truth too heavy for the world. That night, millions gathered in living rooms, in streets, in public squares, in silence. Candles were lit, songs were played, tears fell across every continent. The world mourned the king of pop, but Talia mourned something deeper. She mourned the man who had tried to tell them all, in his own quiet way, that he was leaving. In his house, his children slept, unaware at first of the full weight of what had happened. Photographs lined the walls, memories frozen in time that would now carry new meaning. And somewhere beyond the noise of headlines and tributes, Michael's presence lingered in every gesture he had made in his final days, in every hug, Every thank you, every bow, every pause, every glance toward the sky. Years later, when people asked Talia what she remembered most about those last days, she did not speak of choreography or rehearsals or fame. She spoke of stillness. She spoke of gratitude. She spoke of a man who had moved through his final hours as if he knew every second was precious. And she always said the same thing. He didn't leave in fear. He left in awareness. The world would remember Michael Jackson for his music, his dance, his brilliance. But Talia would always remember him for something quieter, for the way he said goodbye without ever saying a word. And in that goodbye, he left a final message that echoed beyond every stage he had ever walked. Live fully, love deeply, notice the light, and never wait too long to say what matters. Because time does not ask permission. It simply moves. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who loves Michael Jackson. If this story inspired you, remember, even legends face battles unknown to the world. Subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who loves Michael Jackson.